Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be able to make this presentation, and it's also good to see some familiar faces here too. So thank you for coming along. I also just want to acknowledge, in terms of the input and preparing this presentation, Tim Rendell is sitting in the front here. Tim is a colleague of mine that's been, with the two of us, have been working on this really very amazing project, actually, that I'll be giving details of during this talk. Okay, so let's see where we are. Is this working? Oops, got a delay here, I guess. All right, so what I'm going to do is initially provide some background overall in terms of the issue of global development, perhaps, and then go and give you some more details about our so-called appropriate scale mechanization consortium that falls under the USAID. And then I want to talk about how we've gone about engaging in the countries, actually 4 developing countries where we're working in this particular project. And then also discuss what's the sort of effective way of deploying technology in these countries? How do we do that implementation? How do we evaluate what's happening in those countries, issues of scaling up and so on? And then I'll end off with some final comments. Okay, so today when we look at the situation, as all of us know, really we have a lot of people in the world are undernourished. And if you look at the relative proportion, I think it's 1 in 9 people are undernourished. Also, in terms of this particular undernourished population, pretty much all of them are in developing countries, actually 98% of them. And then on top of that, we know that we have this rapidly expanding population, which will exceed 9 billion by 2050. And a large segment of that is in the developing country realm where the undernourishment is prevalent. And in terms of where the population growth is going to take place, again, in the developing country world, Africa, China, and other countries that are developing, that's where we expect a lot of the future population growth to take place. So what about mechanization? What is the role of mechanization? Well, it's perhaps the most neglected aspect of global food security in some ways. According to the FAO of the UN, less than 10% of farming operations are performed with engine power, okay? Less than 10%. 25% are performed with draft animals. And then finally, over 70% of the farm work is done by manual labor, mostly women, the elderly, and children. And we actually saw this firsthand in Ethiopia taking place. So mechanization is really critical, obviously, to reduce drudgery, to try and help these people that are involved with manual labor mostly, and especially women who take a big role there in the farming side of things. We want to increase productivity. We want to improve the quality and the timeliness of farm operations as well. We want to improve so-called intensification. How can we intensify food production, but also extensify it, expand it out? Part of it is reducing losses. There's a lot of wastage that occurs out there, which could be reduced. And then bottom line is increasing household income, reducing poverty, creating markets for products. And then, part of that is emphasizing or enhancing entrepreneurship. And this is a very big part of what we'll look at, and I'll describe that some more. So in terms of the Feed the Future program that the USAID is involved in, along with some other agencies, looking very much at hosting country-led priorities, focusing on smallholder farmers, and then targeting research, capacity building, and other sort of developmental kind of activities. And this is, bottom line is sustainably reducing global poverty and hunger. In order for this to happen, a whole lot of so-called innovation labs have been put into place, 24 of them. And the soybean value chain or innovation lab is actually hosted here at the University of Illinois. We fall under the so-called Sustainable Intensification Innovation Lab. As you see here, this is the structure under that lab. Our particular project got started in October 2015. It's a 4-year project, and we are a consortium, one of two consortia falling under this innovation lab. There are also sub-awards addressing needs within specific countries, 6 countries actually. We work in 4 of those, as I will show you. In terms of our overall team in the US, we have 4 organizations, other institutions, total institutions, so Michigan State, Kansas State, North Carolina A&T, and quite a broad range of expertise, as you will see there, right? You know, from engineering, mechanization, through to having gender specialists involved, and economists, animal nutritionists. So this is really important, actually, to be able to leverage this broad amount of expertise in this particular project. In addition, we have Tim as the project manager, and Maria Jones, who's in the audience here, is our sort of gender person, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So a big part of this is the concept of sustainable intensification. So first of all, we want to provide sustainable solutions wherever it is. This is, you know, addressing environmental impacts, dealing with labor and human drudgery, water and energy needs. But we also want to intensify the production. We want to improve nutrition, improve the economic local sort of benefits as well. So that's what the sustainable intensification is really trying to do. Our particular consortium, what is our goal? So we have this long thing of assess, develop, adapt, implement, promote appropriate scale ag mechanization for sustainable intensification, focusing on smallholder farming systems and enhancing the participation of women in the whole process in helping to establish technologies for ag development. Where are we working? 4 developing countries. So in Africa, on the west side, we have Burkina Faso. On the east side, we have Ethiopia. In Asia, we have Bangladesh and also Cambodia. And in each country, there are specific value chains. In Asia, obviously, rice is important. In Africa, maize or corn. Also in Africa, in both cases, livestock comes into the picture because they use animal power a lot at the moment. And then the interesting one is vegetables, vegetable production in Cambodia and in Ethiopia. And why is that interesting? Well, a lot of women are involved in producing vegetables, and it has impacts on nutrition. And in each country also there are specific regions, and you can see that we've also engaged with a university in each country, and I'll talk about that some more. So the approach we've adopted is to look in terms of technology. Are these technologies multifunctional, modular in form, that they can be used for a variety of different needs? Are they versatile? Are they affordable? Very important. Are they scalable? And bottom line, we want them to obviously reduce drudgery in terms of operation, especially for women. And we are obviously, as mentioned already, focusing on smallholder applications, tasks for the on-farm application. And a very important part of this is building in-country capacity, whether it's at the university themselves or outreach with the farmers and other folks as well. And part of it also very much integrating the gender aspects, making sure that we come up with sort of measurable impacts, and how do we do that, and providing important knowledge to the stakeholders, and then finally, very importantly, facilitating the creation of business ventures, making it a business dimension. A lot of it is also overcoming existing barriers in mechanization in these countries, and it's amazing what kind of barriers there are there. And again, already mentioned about building capacity in these countries. Oops, sorry, it looks like it's gone a bit beyond there for some reason. So the structure, the strategy we followed, first of all, we've established a sort of strategy that we can implement that identifies sort of high priority areas. Part of it is gaining insight in country as to what the needs are, what are the perspectives locally amongst the stakeholders, and we'll talk about that some more. And looking at how we can actually improve the quality of life and the livelihood of these smallholder farmers in a sustainable way. Part of it is also exploring synergies and partnerships with those stakeholders in country. And then finally looking at, well, what kind of resources are available locally as well that can be leveraged. Key questions that come up that we addressed right from the beginning, what are the critical needs in each country relative to the different value chains? What are the top challenges that are foreseen in country related to these value chains? And then what kind of opportunities could be leveraged in those countries in terms of moving forward to address those challenges? And then what might they be seen locally as to the top opportunities, top priorities that need to be addressed there, and who should be addressing them, and who should partner in terms of addressing those needs. So our strategy then, from the beginning, was to adopt a very strong user-centric approach. In other words, engaging the local stakeholders in order to make sure that they had full ownership of the activities taking place in country. Okay. Also, we adopted a systems approach, and I'll talk about that some more, and identifying the fact that you can't just take little pieces of the whole thing and work with those. You've got to think about the whole system in order to be effective. And then finally, how do we scale up and out? We want this to be sustainable. So part of it is how do we scale it out in the country and even beyond just that country, perhaps. So the strategy we followed is we've established innovation hubs in each country at a university. So we identified a university, we approached them, we had identified leadership at the university, and then used that as a means of then networking with the stakeholders, whether it's the farmers, of course, very important, NGOs, government people, entrepreneurs, the people within the university, of course. So all these potential stakeholders locally that would be important to connect with in terms of this work. And so the Innovation Hub then serves that purpose. Beyond that also, we have established field hubs or technology parks in the rural areas, typically maybe at a farm in the rural area. And that farm or hub in the field area is then to be able to connect with those farmers in that area, the women, of course, and the youth. And I'll talk about that some more too, the youth as well. And then use that field hub to be able to provide demonstrations of technologies. Well, this is how you do it now, but if you did it this way, this would be the impact, all right? It could be also providing farmer field schools, so facilities and resources that allow us to connect directly with the farming community. So right from the beginning, when we got started with the project, we held workshops in each country, and the purpose of those workshops was very much to connect with the local stakeholders and go through the process of establishing what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what are the priorities. And so the local stakeholders there, that included the farmers, government representatives, non-government, and so on, were all there. And you can see some pictures that were taken at some of those events within each country. In Burkina Faso, we had about 80 people at the workshop. And there was a huge contingent of women. It was fantastic, about 20 women that were at that particular workshop. And so we really, I think, had a good participation from all the stakeholders and had them be able to identify all the needs moving forward. What we also did pretty much at the same time after those workshops was we went on field visits, so we could then directly connect with the farmers and see what was happening out in the field. And again, we had some great opportunities of meeting with farmers. One that really stands out for me was in Ethiopia, where we were going along the field, and suddenly we had these people come on horseback. And there was all these farmers there ready to greet us, and we went and then met them in a big shed, but it was over 100 farmers. And we then had this opportunity of communicating with them directly and asking them what they thought the major problems were. So a very worthwhile sort of process that took place. So coming back to the systems aspect. So again, some emphasis for that. Why do we do that? It's really being able to understand the whole system, the whole value chain, from what's happening in the field to post-harvest, to marketing, and the impacts economically. It's to really understand all the elements of that value chain that is so important. Because as much as you may change, bring in a new planting operation, how does that impact things downstream, Or when you bring in a new harvester, okay, it may reduce losses, but what's the quality of what you're producing out of the harvester? And again, what are the economic sort of impacts of that? So we're very conscious of looking at the overall system. And, there are social impacts as well. So in terms of women, the family impacts, reducing the amount of time that maybe women have to spend in the field, maybe freeing them up to go and be able to take care of their families, for instance, that kind of thing comes into it. And again, you look at the economics, impact on the environment. So if we can move more to a conservation ag model, how does that impact the environment as well? Very interestingly enough, very recently, the National Academy of Sciences put out a publication about science breakthroughs that were needed to advance food and agricultural research by 2030. Breakthrough 1, a systems approach to understand the nature of interactions among the different elements of the food and agricultural system can be leveraged to increase overall system efficiency, resilience, and sustainability. So there, some really worthwhile sort of amplification of the value of doing it this way. So just to give you some sort of ideas of the sort of systems part and how we think about the technologies. So part of it is thinking, well, how can the technologies impact on what's happening there? So some technologies could be sort of incremental in nature. Others could be much more disruptive. And an example is, we're going from manual labor to animal power. So that's quite a big jump in terms of productivity. Okay, so animals can really increase productivity in the field. But we could take that a step further and go to, say, a single axle tractor, which again will be a big jump up from animal power. And then one could even look at, say, a two-axle tractor as well. So you have this sense of, well, what should one do and what is appropriate in that particular location? And it's important, I think, not to neglect the incremental technologies. And I'll show you an example of that. But maybe there are advantages in sort of leapfrogging forward to a more disruptive type of technology. But it may be more difficult for that to be accepted locally, okay? It may be more difficult to implement that locally. All right, so as an example, in Burkina Faso, we work with Tillers International. It's an NGO based in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They work a lot with the Amish. But one of the things that they do is help farmers look at the design of the yoke for the animals, the oxen. And so they went to Burkina Faso and they, I think, had 20 or more farmers, and they worked with those farmers to fabricate these different yokes, different designed yokes, okay? And they were much more ergonomic, much more comfortable for the animals to have around their necks, to then allow them to work longer. One simple thing, I'm an engineer, so we're thinking, well, one of the things, if you think about the yoke and you hook up the implement a little bit lower down in the yoke, it kind of creates a twisting effect so that the force is more around the neck instead of just at the back of the neck. And so much more comfortable for the oxen to be working through the field. Other things that they also did was they worked with the oxen much earlier to train them to be much more maneuverable in the field as well. So you can think of this is a more like an incremental type of technology as opposed to leaping forward to having a single axle tractor. Okay, so in order, we kind of, in terms of sort of evaluating our activities, Joseph Kinzel works for the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, and he put out this publication with sort of 10 elements of a framework that helps to address sustainable agricultural mechanization. And we thought, wow, this is really appropriate for us to look at. So I'm going to just go through them, and I'm going to highlight a little bit on the first two. But creating an enabling environment for the sustainability of ag mechanization. Promoting sustainable ag practices for smallholders. Integrating smallholders into value chains. Okay? So having ownership of what's happening. Maximizing economic, social, and gender advantages for smallholders. Leveraging specific models for smallholder upscaling. Again, this is targeting that business model. Strengthening the use of IT or information technologies. This is really interesting, you know, that in some ways, though, in the developing countries, they are leaping forward with IT. When I mentioned about Ethiopia, when we met with the farmers, one of the questions I asked those farmers, how many of you have got cell phones? 75% of them had cell phones or some sort of phone technology. So you could then see, wow, well, you know, we could really leverage IT perhaps in some way to be able to outreach to this farming community. Building capacity at all levels, whether it's, you know, at the farmer level, NGO, government, tertiary, high school, whatever. Integrating the ag mechanization into policy frameworks. So in terms of government connections, very important. How do we make sure that we have some connections with government to think about policy changes? Facilitating private sector development. Yeah, so in terms of scaling up and out, looking at the business model for technologies in order for them to be sustainable. And then finally, promoting regional cooperation and networking. So how do we leverage different entities in the country that can help with that aspect? So just to talk about the first two a little bit. Creating an enabling environment for sustainability. So part of it is, you know, looking at technologies that can reduce the labor burden via mechanization. And what's listed there is actually a whole lot of technologies that are currently being developed or in use in the countries that we've had some involvement with. So ranging from harvesters, reapers, to transplanters for rice, ox-drawn planters, vegetable hand tools, pumps for you know, pulling water out of wells that rely on solar power, maize shellers, so a fairly large range of different technologies there that are being investigated there. And then about the business side of things, so potential models looking at service provision development, so service providers in the country. Individual farmers, they cannot typically afford the equipment or the technology themselves. So we have to think about, well, are there ways to help the farmer be able to afford equipment being used on their farms to plant, harvest, whatever it might be. I'll show you this example in Burkina Faso, leveraging a blacksmith association to manufacture the tools, the planters, the rippers, and so on. In Cambodia, there's a voucher system being set up to create linkages between the service provider and the farmers to provide some incentives, economic incentives, to create that connection. And then private sector partnerships, especially in Bangladesh, this is happening already, where the private sector is engaged and, you know, being able to provide services to the farmers. Further, in terms of promoting the practice of sustainable ag for smallholders, so a really big drive is moving towards conservation ag. Ideally, no tillage, okay? That's quite a stretch given that, you know, a lot of conventional tillage takes place currently in those countries. But already in Cambodia, there's a group there, a very active group actually involved with conservation ag, been involved for 10 years at least, I think, and already are able to show the benefits of that. And the thing is, with conservation ag, it takes time, as many of you probably know. It takes time to show the value of conservation ag. And it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen even 1 year. It happens over 5, 10 years before you actually see the benefits of conservation ag. But you've got to start. You've got to get it in place. And so a lot of what we are trying to do is then encourage the use of ag practices and the development of tillage or no-till kind of operations to encourage that conservation dimension in the different countries. So Cambodia, this is happening already to a large extent. Bangladesh, they're looking at no-till type of planters. And Burkina, the practices that are taking place there, they're ripping instead of ploughing the whole field, just ripping a line along the field, so it's not the whole field that's being ploughed. And so different sort of ways of bringing in practices that have some impact there that are important for the environment. Also in Burkina, looking at sort of fodder production as well, and intercropping, this I think also in Ethiopia. So one of the things, that's not too good. I've just lost all the titles there that should have been there. But one of the important things is to be able to measure have some measures of the impact. So what are the indicators that we could leverage to be able to show, well, whatever is being introduced as far as these technologies are concerned, what is happening with that? So the top block there is productivity, actually. So, of course, we can then measure, well, how much does it reduce drudgery? How much quicker can we get the operations done? Okay? So that would be sort of the productivity part. Another part would be the economics. How is it impacting on the economic side there? How is it impacting the environment? And then from a social aspect, how is it impacting the participation of women, men, the family? And then the other one is the sort of human condition aspect of it that comes into play. It's maybe a little more difficult to measure, but how does it impact on the sort of basic human benefits, so to speak? So that's very important that we have those measures in place. And as we work with our in-country folks, we emphasize trying to be able to measure all of those parameters, or have as many of them measured as possible. And you can see some examples there shown. Again, on the scaling up and out, mentioned some of these already, targeting some sustainable business models around the equipment. Custom hire, mentioned that already. Farmer cooperatives or associations. I mentioned this one maybe a little bit, the custom hire in Bangladesh, working with companies there already. And there on the left-hand side is actually a sort of mini combine harvester that's used for rice that's been introduced. There on the bottom right is a transplanter in Bangladesh as well. So these are some technologies that already some folks there in the custom hire side are providing. Mentioned about blacksmiths, the blacksmiths in Burkina Faso. So there they've already started to manufacture rippers and planters actually, which is really exciting. And so you could see that this could become a sort of a business model for them that could be expanded out within the country. In Burkina, some more details about there. There we're looking very much at the combination of crops and livestock, because again, animal power is very important. And you can kind of see the relative involvement, manual power versus draft versus tractors. Very dominant manual power, I mentioned that already. Draft animals comes next, very little in terms of tractors right now in Burkina Faso. Priorities there, land preparation, planting, weed control, water use and conservation. And some pictures are there in the bottom right. That's pretty much how the planting is done in Burkina Faso. There you have the women folk then actually planting there. Other things in terms of Burkina, so what's been happening, I already mentioned about the training of oxen, the improved ox yoke. Land preparation comes into it as well. Sowing, they have a redesigned planter that can be pulled behind the oxen that's much more precise and reduces the drudgery, of course, because you're using the animals instead of humans. Weed control comes into it, of course, as well, manual kind of weed control. And so these are some technologies there with Burkina. Again, these are all kind of just some more pictures about those particular technologies there with the planter, the ox yoke, and so on. In Ethiopia, some of the technologies that are being looked at there, there's a solar-powered pump called the Magi pump that was actually developed here by a Professor Brian Lilly, who has now made it available in all these different countries. And so we've deployed these Magi pumps there, about 50 of them in the farming community. They require no batteries, interesting enough, so just solar power, and they're sort of under evaluation right now. Also, ox-driven planters are being looked at there, similar to Burkina Faso, forage choppers for the animal feed, and then they're also looking at maize shillers there. Bangladesh, I've already mentioned a little bit, but rice transplanters being looked at because of the drudgery of planting rice is already big there. And then, of course, the reaping or harvesting of the rice is also very labor intensive, so reapers and mini combine harvesters can have a really big impact there in terms of the drudgery. And then they've also looked at axial flow pumps for controlling water, especially they have a delta there in Bangladesh where there are quite a lot of interesting water issues. One of the interesting things with Bangladesh, in terms of thinking about youth development or even student development, we had a symposium there in Bangladesh in November last year. And what we did before the symposium is we solicited posters from students there from different universities. Actually, it ended up being 7 universities, to then have them develop posters around the topic of appropriate scale mechanization. And we had 60 submissions from them. It was amazing. And we then selected 5 to be presented at the symposium, and then they got awards as well. But it just sparked so much interest and activity related to looking at appropriate scale mechanization. And they were really inventive, these teams of students at these different universities. And I think the government is even wanting to expand that idea and use it elsewhere as well. But it was a very successful process that we went through there. Cambodia, just a couple of things there. So they're looking at a development of a 2-wheel tractor-pulled seeder. Again, because of seeding, planting rice is a big issue. They even have a motorcycle that they have a broadcaster mounted on the back of, which is kind of interesting. And then crimping, that's especially for the conservation ag, dealing with cover crops there. And then even a 4-wheel tractor-pulled seeder that they have been developing. Okay, turning to gender, and I must acknowledge Maria Jones, who's in the audience, is a very important part of this, and Tim has also been very heavily involved in this. But we've been able to leverage AgReach, who are on our campus in the College of ACES, who are part of the Ingenious project there, the Integrating Gender and Nutrition with Ag Extension Services. And Maria is being very instrumental in helping us develop some tools to be able to evaluate and assess the technology implementation and application in these countries, and understanding the impacts of these technologies and being able to measure them, and also can engage with the woman as well in looking at these technologies. And it's really exciting to see, things are happening. And actually, both Maria and Tim went to Burkina Faso fairly recently and held workshops with the woman there to try and establish, what are the key issues and challenges for them, and how to potentially then look at technologies from their viewpoint and be able to evaluate them. And this will be expanded to our other 3 countries as well. So this is just expanding a bit more there. One other thing that they've also done is they've held some webinars here, but extended out globally to all the countries to then connect with various people around the globe to then highlight, the issues of training women and people to be sensitive to the gender aspects as well. And this has really been amazing, actually, and very uplifting to see this being able to take place. And thank you to Maria and Tim for moving it forward. Then, engaging youth. So this is something that maybe tends to be neglected to some degree, in my opinion. But what's interesting here in Cambodia, so we talked about the field hubs. They call them technology parks. They've established a technology park in the grounds of a high school, okay? In the grounds of a high school, where they've dug out an aquaculture pond. They have these plots for growing rice and vegetables. And they then held a competition with those students, those high school students, and created teams. There were about 7 members per team of these high school kids. And each team then grew vegetables on 6 plots. And they included sort of biocontrol, mulching, all the sort of practices that one ideally should have with growing vegetables. And then there was held a competition to look at those, and we went and judged those, and then the top 3 got awards. But it was just incredible. I don't know if you can see in the top right there the picture of the students out in the field. But having all these high school kids involved in agriculture. And I should mention, we visited the school earlier, a year earlier, and in a classroom there were 40 of these kids. And we then went around the classroom and said, well, okay, what do you want to do when you grow up? The majority, doctors. How many in ag? Maybe 2, okay? Some engineers, business people. But so you can see the value of trying to introduce something like this where they can also see the benefit of the whole system as well. Agro-processing, marketing, making a living out of ag. So holding those people, getting those people, students engaged. What's happened subsequently, the Royal University of Ag that we've involved in there in Cambodia, they've provided scholarships for some of these students, high school students, to create a pipeline to their university. Fantastic. Absolutely wonderful kind of thing to be developed. So anyway, we're very conscious of how do we engage with youth and promote things there. Okay, just some final comments. So some of the things that we are really conscious of needing to do, we want to strengthen our engagement through these hubs that we have, both at the universities and in the field. Explore the use of solar power. This is really emphasized, renewable energy sources. How do we leverage information technologies as well? How do we engage the private sector and look at business models for scaling up and out? How do we integrate the process of mechanization into policy frameworks? Emphasizing the need for data collection as we move forward to show how well these technologies work. Empowering farmers to actively participate in the value chain, in the downstream part of it, marketing, etc. And then, as I've mentioned, leveraging the linkages with NGOs as well. So these are things that we still really need, we believe are important for us to continue doing and emphasize in the future. And I will stop there. So thank you very much. I guess it's possible to have some questions, maybe, if we've got a bit of...
Can you repeat the gist of the question, too, for the radio audience?
Yeah.
But it might be hard to summarize, really, because I know there's a small commitment for sustainability in this country, and I see that as a response to the overdeveloped, highly carbon-intensive agriculture that we have here. And I think maybe if there was more commitment to that, the plight of the third lesser developed countries would be better if we stopped putting our carbon footprint all over them. But I see you have some sensitivity to that in your appropriate development. I'm kind of wondering what the scale of your projects and the various connections are as far as how many countries you mentioned, 3, I think, maybe.
Well, there are 4, actually.
Okay.
Although in terms of the portfolio for the Sustainable Intensification Lab, there are actually 6 countries. So in addition, there's Senegal, and I can't remember, is it Ghana? Sorry? Oh, Tanzania, that's right. I knew it was, so it's Senegal, Tanzania, obviously Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, and then in Asia it's Bangladesh and Cambodia. So those, so again, part of this is, so as much as we're working in those particular countries, a lot of what we are trying to do or facilitate could be introduced and expanded to other countries. And so we are very conscious, are there ways that we can be connecting with other countries as well to highlight the potential way of facilitating these activities. Any other? Yes, sir.
As a follow-up to that, how do you define technology as sustainable? So what are you trying to promote? What are you trying to find?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So how do we kind of define the sustainability or evaluate the sustainability of technologies. So it unfortunately didn't come up so well. So there are indicators that we try and use to reflect that sustainability. And the sort of key areas I sort of mentioned: productivity. So we think about sustainable, sustainable intensification is the big umbrella. So we want to intensify food production, okay, but we want to do it in a sustainable way, okay. So that's good environment. So in terms of the intensification part, you might see that as the productivity. How can we increase the work rate of machines? How can we help those local communities be more productive by increasing how quickly they can get the job done, so to speak, whether it's planting, harvesting, and also part of it will be improving the quality of the products as well there. So that's part of it, the sort of productivity part. Another very important part would be the economics. So in terms of productivity, also the economics part of it. So we want to help them improve their quality, their cost of living or their quality of living. So can they be producing rice, maize, whatever, and vegetables that can then go to a market, and then they get some income from that. And so it becomes a sort of business aspect, and they get a return on what they're doing, as opposed to maybe what's happening now. A lot of it is just subsistence, okay? So, adding that dimension of the economic benefit as well. But part of that in terms of the economic side is, well, the technology costs money, okay? So how do they afford that technology? So again, part of it is looking at the economics as we're looking at, different models of service providers perhaps, or farmer associations that can come together to be able to then afford that equipment, or getting the private sector to come in and be able to provide some sort of service, provide that service too maybe. So different models that can then impact the farmers being able to afford that equipment in the field there. Then the environment. So what about the environment? So soil quality is a huge one, soil health and water usage, okay? So what can be done to improve the soil quality? So moving towards a more conservation ag type of ag practice, where you are then reducing the amount of tillage, you are introducing cover crops maybe, so some strategies that can then have quite a big impact on the soil quality, okay, reducing runoff, soil erosion, all those things that come into play. But then part of it is also the water usage as well. For vegetables, maybe we are going to be relying on some irrigation systems. Perhaps we can introduce a drip irrigation system, which is much more efficient in terms of the water application, okay? So good for water use efficiency. But, then there's the broader climate change issue. And again, the conservation dimension impacts that, because you are essentially growing more matter, vegetable matter or plant matter that's pulling, CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then is having a positive impact on the sort of climate change dimension as well. But then again, then there's the whole impact on the social side of things. So in terms of the sort of family dynamics, so you think about a family that's involved there out in the field. So the woman is expected to do this and this, the man is expected to do this and this. So if we now bring in a technology, how does it change that? Does it free up the woman so that, because we can do the job quicker, that person can now go and spend more time with the family, or do some other important activities that are beneficial from a family standpoint? Obviously, there are some other really high-level issues that need to be accounted for, cultural issues. you know, in certain cultures, you know, the woman has her role, the man has her role. And so how do you then look at that and help to facilitate creating a different viewpoint about the woman's role, the man's role, okay? And even children, how they come into the picture as well. What else in the human dimension? Tim, am I? Oh yeah, nutrition, oh gosh, very important, nutrition. So from with the vegetables, how do we encourage families to be leveraging vegetable production and be able to then improve their nutrition through that process? And even communities where you're producing the vegetables that can be marketed in a community to then improve the general nutritional levels in that community. So there are so many factors that come into play. I'm an engineer, okay, but we have these so many different dimensions that need to be addressed. You know, the technology, in some ways, as I tell people, is probably the easiest part. It's all these other factors that come into play that are critical, that have to be considered in the overall picture. And again, it's that system dimension. I don't know if that sort of helped to answer your question to some degree. I don't, Tim, is there anything that you wanted to mention as well? It's okay. Yes, sir.
I believe in many parts of the world, to increase agricultural productivity, you should simply throw fertilizer at the problem.
Yeah.
But that leads us into the question of the industrial capabilities of actually producing the fertilizer.
Yes.
So in these particular countries, I'm guessing that throwing fertilizer at the problem would be a benefit. But how do you do that in a country-sustainable way?
Yeah. Yeah, and connected with that would also be the seed, you know, in terms of the sourcing the seed and dealing with, you know, GMO issues. How do we, that obviously comes into the picture now. For instance, in Burkina Faso, in Ethiopia, they're looking at animal compost, manure, to provide the fertilizer, okay, which is obviously good. You know, you're recycling, you're making use of a sort of locally produced fertilizer, so to speak. But it may not be enough, and so you may need to supplement that. But so it is an issue about, you know, the fertilizing as well. As if we move towards a conservation ag sort of model, you know, the fertilizer issue is somewhat addressed in that you can maybe, the cover crops that you select to grow can in a way provide the nutritional needs of growing the crops. Okay, so how can you leverage that sort of conservation ag cover crop kind of dimension to deal with the fertilizer issue? Is something that is you know, quite an interesting way of perhaps dealing with that. I don't know if that yeah. Yes, Anne.
I'm just curious your thoughts on, there's certain parts of the world where there's a movement away from economic productivity and agriculture towards, not subsistence, but self-sufficiency. For example, last month, when I was in Guatemala, I was talking with a rural development expert who was saying that they're trying to get farmers away from this sense that they have to produce. How does that square with what you're doing, and does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's an interesting dimension. So I think, you know, as a first sort of level, we would certainly be wanting to target self-sufficiency, okay? So at least producing enough food locally to sustain the local population, okay? Bottom line. But is that enough, you know? And part of it is really, you know, for those people to be able to afford, you know, what they need to have in terms of resources or whatever, it has to go beyond that, I would think. So where do they get the money to purchase different things, to be able to produce the crops that they want to produce? So I think there has to be some means of them developing or generating their own income, okay? And hopefully they can do it through agricultural sources. Now, so what happens a lot now, of course, is you have this migration of people from the rural areas to the urban areas. And the people that are now moved to the urban area, they send money back to the rural areas to keep the rural folk going, okay? But is that really a good way of doing things? Wouldn't it be much better to generate an enterprise in the rural area that can then sustain the rural area? And so I think that's a lot of what we would like to see, the sort of rural agro-processing, creating your own sort of economic environment to be able to generate income and so on. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned the innovation hubs in the universities?
Yes.
Field hubs?
Yes.
How do you go about identifying locations and stakeholders for field hubs?
Yes, so I mean, that's an interesting one. So right at the beginning, I guess part of it is in terms of our team members, some of them had already had connections with those universities in country. And so that was really helpful. In some cases, they may already have had working on different projects, like in Bangladesh, it was to do with post-harvest loss. There was a post-harvest loss innovation lab, and they had already connected with the Bangladesh Agricultural University. And so we actually leveraged those same people to be involved in our project as well. And it's worked incredibly well to have that connection. And the same somewhat applied to the other universities in the other countries as well. But obviously, there may be quite a few institutions that one could potentially select from. But the bottom line is that to at least have one that you can rely on to have that connection. And then a big part of it is then being able to network with all the stakeholders, particularly the government people, government representation there, the farmers themselves, of course, reaching out into the rural communities, NGOs that are typically there, and so on. But yeah, I think we were pretty fortunate in terms of the institutions that we connected with there. Okay. Well, thank you.